On our current trajectory of emissions, the world is expected to warm by about 1.5 C relative to pre-industrial levels by about 2030, get to 2 C by about 2050. There's a Ben Franklin quote that I read recently that I think about all the time in this context, which is, by failing to prepare, you're preparing to fail. We found that we had deployed about 10% of the technologies we would need to get to net zero by 2050 or to meet commitments by 2050.
Well, welcome back to the Green Hour. We are here live at the Concordia Annual Summit during Climate Week, New York City. We are sitting here with Mekala Krishnan, partner at McKinsey Global Institute. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Wonderful to be joining you.
Yeah, so I think the first thing is, what is McKinsey Global Institute and what is the work that you do?
So the McKinsey Global Institute is McKinsey & Company, the consulting firm, our business and economics research arm. It's essentially our think tank that sits inside of McKinsey. And we look at a variety of economic questions that are top of mind for companies, for policymakers, and individuals around the world. So we do research on topics related to human potential and labor markets, topics related to global trade, a whole variety of things. And then the work that I lead, which is under a pillar that we describe as the resources of the world. And so it's really investigating questions of how the world can better use its energy, its material resources, and its climate, and think about how to better use these to improve the lives of people around the world.
So I know with like McKinsey & Company, companies will hire the firm to do work. Is that similar with the Global Institute, or is that kind of a separate?
So we're an independent think tank. We do research that we think is important for the world. And of course, it's important for companies and leaders and as I said, policymakers and individuals. Yeah. But it's entirely work that we shape. We develop the research questions that we want to try and answer. We develop the approach to doing the research. The insights are entirely our own. So it's an entirely independent institution.
Awesome.
It's a really fun job.
Yeah, it sounds like it, right? It sounds like it. Well, got a lot of questions here on climate, right? On this resource conversation, but a term that's thrown around a lot right now is adaptation, right? Climate adaptation. And the question is, why do you say adaptation is not plan B, but the front line of climate action?
So the way to think about what climate adaptation is first, and then to answer your question, the world experiences a range of climate hazards today, right? We are sitting in New York that gets rained on, is often very hot. I come originally from India, which is a country that experiences rain, it experiences heat. And so as a result of that, human societies and economies have built the capacity to deal with that climate, which is essentially what one calls adaptation or resilience. And so it's putting in place either technologies or practices that help you live with the climate around you, a thing that we do in some ways every day. The reason we're talking about climate adaptation now more and more is that the climate is not the same as the climate of the past, and it's not likely to be the same in the future. As the Earth warms, we are at about 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming relative to pre-industrial levels, expected to be at, and that warming that warming could increase going forward. And so communities and companies and individuals need to think about how we adapt, not just for the climate of today, but also think about a changing climate going forward. Now, the reason why it's, to use your language, not a plan B is that if you think about all the efforts that the world is making to reduce emissions, the fact remains that on our current trajectory of emissions, which lead to warming, on our current trajectory of emissions, the world is expected to warm by about 1.5 C relative to pre-industrial levels by about 2030, get to 2 C by about 2050. And so even as we think about how to reduce emissions, it's also important to prepare for that climate that is likely to hit us relatively soon. 2030 might seem far away, 2050 might seem very far away. But if you think about many of the solutions we're talking about, they take time to build. If you're talking about building a seawall or flood-proofing a building, these things are things that take time. And so we need to start planning that today. So it's not an either or, and it must be part of the conversation today.
So as you talk about, global temperature rise, we're comparing to pre-industrial level. You said 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030, 2 degrees Celsius by, I think, 2040. Paris Agreement is by 2050, right? We can't exceed these or we're going to have some pretty bad effects, on the Earth. So what are some of those effects we're seeing today, as global temperatures rise?
Yeah, so firstly, I would say that the Paris Agreement, as just to clarify, as described, does not have a timeline in mind. It has a temperature in mind. So it's essentially saying the world should make every effort to limit warming to well below 2C and ideally limit to 1.5. And so with that, the reason that we're talking about that is, at least what the climate science tells us, is that as the Earth warms, various forms of physical risks will intensify. I think it's important to put all of that in context of where we stand today. So already today, we aren't adapted to manage the climate of today. So again, coming from India, it's a place that gets hot. How do you manage heat? One way to manage heat is to have air conditioners. Air conditioning penetration in India is only about 10%. And so people are living with very hot climates without this cooling technology that exists in other parts of the world. So one reason this is one sort of physical impact is heat. And we need to think about that even today. And then as the Earth warms, things like heat, things like flood, things like drought, all of these are effects that are likely to either become more frequent or become more intense. And so that's the forward-looking planning we need to do, manage the climate of today and plan for these increases that would happen going forward.
So, I mean, you brought up technology earlier, right? And as you're looking at adaptation, you're looking at maybe flooding that might happen in the future. Are there softwares out there, technology out there that can actually spot these things and help the people in those places, come up with solutions now where they're not going to have these effects in the future?
Yeah, so it's so interesting when we look at this question of adaptation. In many ways, we have already all the technologies we need to adapt. And in some cases, by the way, we've been doing this already for decades, centuries, even millennia. We've had irrigation systems in Mesopotamian civilizations that have managed drought and flooding events. If you think about the sea dikes that exist around Netherlands, that's been, again, in place for decades and some form of flood protection for even longer than that. And so from one way to look at this is to say, actually, we have a lot of these measures already today to adapt. Now, technology can help improve on that. We can continue to innovate. And one sort of exciting innovation is, can we think about better prediction of when weather events are likely to occur? And so there's a lot of discussion now around better early warning systems using satellites, better AI-based weather solutions to help us better understand when an event is actually likely to occur. So I think we can continue to innovate. But I think what is so interesting to me, at least, about this space is we have many of the measures already. Many have been applied, as I said, for decades or even centuries. The question is really, how do we scale them and how do we get them to the communities that need them?
And then, I mean, the conversation on developed nations versus developing nations, I think, is a pretty important one, too. So with developing nations, right, they might not have the financing available, do some of these things around adaptation. So, I guess I would just ask, what are developing nations doing? And then how can we help them, adapt to the climate?
Yeah, so I think oftentimes actually this conversation in developing countries, probably rightly so, is framed not just as an adaptation discussion, but rather an economic development question. Meaning, if these measures are not put in place to protect places in both the developed and the developing world, it has the potential to impact economic growth going forward. I'll give you one example. If you think about workers in India. A lot of people in India work in agriculture, work in outdoor work like construction. India is a place, as I said, that is very hot already today, hot and humid, and that heat and humidity is likely to rise going forward. We estimate that by about 2030, with the increases that you would see in heat and humidity levels in India, about 15% of outdoor working hours could be affected. That's because workers get tired, they need to take breaks, they just don't work as effectively. I mean, imagine yourself in like a very hot room. Exactly. Right. Your capacity to work is affected. And so that's all the more exacerbated then when you take a country like India, where it's not just that the heat and humidity effects are high, but actually people are in the sectors that are affected by that heat and humidity. And so for these countries, if you don't solve these issues, it actually is one that could affect their economic growth going forward. And so we've started, I think, as a result of that, seeing more and more countries around the world ask the question of how to adapt. We've seen more governments submit what are called national adaptation plans, which are plans to think about what sorts of adaptation measures they can put in place. We've seen that at the national government level, but also at the local government level. Now, of course, much more needs to be done. Financing is a huge question. Who pays? There's, again, some interesting examples of new forms of financial products. Some of it is traditional, loans that you would give to build a project finance that you would do to build something like a seawall. But we also need more innovation on the types of financial instruments that can be used to deploy these measures at scale.
And I guess financing, philanthropic organizations, they provide financing. I guess even, private sector companies can provide financing. International development banks can provide that as well.
Yeah, and I think as with the decarbonization discussion, even in adaptation, it's not going to be a silver bullet on a certain form of solution or a certain form of financing. We will need multiple measures. It's not just going to be one. We'll need measures to deal with heat versus flooding versus drought. They all look different. Even for heat, there are many, many different types of solutions, everything from planting more trees to create a cooling effect, to painting roofs white, to air conditioning. There's a whole range of measures. So we'll need to think about many measures. We'll need to think about then who actually implements the measure. Is it an individual? Is it a company? Is it government? And then who pays, which is a different question as well. And so all of these are things that as we talk to companies around the world, they're all thinking about. As we talk to leaders across institutions, this question of what measures to put in place and how to pay is really top of mind.
I think India is an interesting case study because, as you said, temperatures are already hot, right? In the summer, they're going to increase. And then I think the stat you said was 10%.
15%.
Or 15%, yeah. Right? Air conditioning across.
10% air conditioning.
Yes, so it's like something's not balanced there, right? So you can see that there's a big problem and hopefully solutions will come, to fix that.
Yeah, and I think part of my hope for this comes from, firstly, the fact that we have many of these measures. We're not innovating on entirely fundamentally new technologies. It's really an execution problem versus an innovation problem. And then, rightly or wrongly, we're faced with these risks today, right? There's a Ben Franklin quote that I read recently that I think about all the time in this context, which is, by failing to prepare, you're preparing to fail. And I do think that more people are realizing that, and it's about better planning and just being strategic about it starting today.
All right. And then, looking at the private sector for a second, what I see when I read ESG reports is we're gonna be net zero by 2030, net zero by 2040. It seems like a lot of companies
are more like 2050.
Like 2050, right? They keep pushing them back, and a lot of these companies are doing it through carbon credits, right? Carbon markets, but I just want to ask you about that whole conversation on, carbon markets with the private sector as they're pushing towards becoming net zero.
Yeah, so I think carbon markets and offsets play an important role when done right. And I think the reason that there's a lot of debate about this is the when done right. And it's also important to differentiate between different forms of carbon markets and carbon mechanisms. Some are compliance markets, some are voluntary. But I think really the question with these is the idea behind these is that you allow for a company to meet a commitment towards net zero or reducing emissions by offsetting it with buying a credit of some kind. That's the kind that you're describing. And if done well, it is actually a very effective financing mechanism because you're providing capital. So if I'm buying a carbon credit to help to avoid deforesting, I'm actually finding a way to both reduce my own emissions footprint in the way that I'm accounting for it, but also provide funding to avoid that deforestation, right? So when done well, it's actually quite an effective tool to manage the finance flows towards these issues. I think the reason they often get a bad rap is because they may not be done well, right? If there's lack of transparency on where the funding is going, if there's a lack of what is called quote unquote additionality, meaning would that avoided deforestation happen anyway, regardless of whether the company made the offset. So these are issues that people are dealing with, but I think people are having very real conversations about how to deal with these sorts of things.
Right. And I think net zero is a great thing. It's a great thing for companies to go towards. And, carbon markets, to your point, if the governance is in place and the transparency is in place, it's like, that's great, right? Because you're providing funding for, let's say, reforestation projects, renewable energy projects. And on a global scale, it makes a lot of sense. But I think the transparency just needs to improve and the governance needs to improve. Because the worst thing I hate to see is I'll read an ESG report and then they talk about net zero, but there's nothing to back it up.
Yeah. Well, and I think what you're also alluding to is ultimately, as we think about driving this transition conversation forward, the energy transition conversation forward, net zero transition conversation forward, the more that it can become less about just the reporting exercise, but the reporting exercise to some end, right? Meaning actually enabling real movement on the ground. I think that's the goal of good reporting, but getting that right is something we're still working through.
Yes. And then, a question on the grid too. We were listening to the CEO, I think, of TC Energy earlier, and I think he was saying that the majority of their energy is natural gas still. In our space, in the environmental space, we're obviously pushing for renewables. But my question to you would be, are renewable technologies scalable at this point to the point of like where natural gas is?
Yeah, so renewable technologies, and really when people say renewable technologies, they're talking about solar and to some extent wind. They are technologies that have enormous promise, right? It's essentially a free and abundant resource, sunshine and wind, and the potential to produce electricity with that. Now, the problem is what happens in periods when the sun doesn't shine and wind doesn't blow, right? So that's ultimately when the rubber hits the road. And that can happen in two ways. It can happen on a daily basis or a weekly basis, what is referred to typically as short-term intermittency. But it can also happen over longer periods, right? If you have the winter time, for example, when skies are gray and the sun isn't shining that much. And so as you think about then how you manage these periods of intermittency, it has a couple of consequences in how you design your grid. The first is that you almost always have to design a bigger grid because you need to manage for periods when the sun doesn't shine and wind doesn't blow. So you put more solar panels, for example, into a system. The second is you need to manage for storage in some way, right? So what do you do when there are periods where the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow is you store electricity in periods when it does in a battery, and then you put it back into the grid. And those storage systems need to be both short-term and long-term to manage these weeks or these months. Or the third kind of thing, and I'm oversimplifying a little bit, there are other measures as well, but the third kind of thing is you connect to other parts. So the sun is not shining in one location and you get electricity from another. What all of that means is a fundamentally different grid than the one that we have today, right? And so it's not about, does solar technologies work as well as natural gas? That's actually, I would say, the wrong question. It's is our grid designed to include solar technologies in a really productive way that is affordable and reliable, right? And I think that's the question that we're all grappling with right now, how to design a grid that can manage these resources. I think it's not a problem when you have 20% renewables, 30% renewables, 40% renewables. But once you start to go to 60, 70, 80% renewables, these are real questions that will come into play. People often worry about data centers and the load that they're going to bring into the system. And it's true, data center load is going to be large. Some estimate would say it could be as much as 10% of electricity demand in 2030, 2040. But if you think about what's happening in the energy transition, as we electrify mobility, as we buy more EVs, we buy more heat pumps, you're getting massive amounts of electricity demand from these end users like mobility or buildings. So data centers, 10% of electricity demand. With EVs, with heat pumps, if you are to get to net zero by 2050, that would mean 300% more electricity demand by 2050. Okay, so 10% data centers in the next few years, 300% by 2050. But the consequence of that is all these conversations about grid reliability, how to manage storage, how to build transmission and distribution infrastructure that we would have to deal with anyway for 2050, we are dealing with now because of data centers. And so to me, this is actually the glass half full, the optimistic case for data center build out today, which is we're grappling with issues we would have to deal with anyway, and we're forced to do them now.
Yeah, in the tech field, I'm pretty sure, I might be wrong, but I think Amazon and Microsoft might have invested money in small modular nuclear, right, to kind of fuel and kind of offset that the emissions associated with the data centers. So nuclear is also a pathway, these small modular reactors. I'm from Georgia. They built Plant Vogtle, which wasn't a great, I would say, process, cost overruns, time overruns, but they got it built. But I think these small modular nuclear reactors are going to be a lot better because they can be scaled a lot faster, they're cheaper, and I think it's a better option.
Well, and I think there's something very real about these hyperscalers that are just hungry for energy and what they can do to spur innovation, exactly to your point, in a whole range of electricity sources, right? It could be also better batteries. It could be carbon capture on gas power plants. So I actually think that the fact that we are dealing with this energy hungriness today will spur a lot of innovation in nuclear, but also in other areas.
And then one of the final questions is around energy security. So I had someone on the podcast in the past talking about critical rare earth minerals, the whole supply chain, and how the U.S. as a nation imports a lot, the processing from like China. That whole conversation on energy security is major because a lot of those rare earth minerals are coming to be actually used in renewable energy technology. So I just asked you about energy security, the importance, where you see that going in the future. Do you think the U.S. will actually continue to build more and more internal energy systems, kind of fight against that energy security?
Yeah, so it's hard to take a crystal ball to this, but maybe the thing I will say is that what's become really clear in the last few years of the sustainability conversation is in some ways the world was, at least the sustainability community was approaching this agenda as an emissions reduction agenda. We've already talked about how adaptation now is a part of that. But even with the emissions reduction agenda, I think what's become abundantly clear is that it cannot be an agenda in isolation and needs to be considered in the context of affordability, of energy security and reliability, and industrial competitiveness. All of these things need to come together to enable a successful transition. If these other things are not factored into account, I think the sustainability, frankly, in the more colloquial sense of the word, the sustainability of the transition agenda is not going to stay. It will create the willingness to pay on the part of the consumer, the impact on companies and their own profitability. All of that starts to get affected if we don't manage this conversation well, and just access to energy and reliable access to energy. So I think it's not just one agenda, it's emissions reduction in the context of affordability, reliability, and competitiveness, all of these things coming together. The final thing maybe I will say to your point on critical minerals is we did a piece of work as the McKinsey Global Institute last year on what we describe as the physical challenges of the energy transition. Because at its core, what you're doing is you're taking this big, enormous energy system that exists today, that has been built up over multiple centuries, built up in the physical sense of being built up. We have oil and gas pipelines that extend the distance from the Earth to the moon and back twice. I mean, think about that. That's like astoundingly huge and complex. So this massive energy system works really well. And we're trying to transform something that's been built over the last 2 centuries in the span of decades now, right? And so what that comes with is a profound question of how do we build things quickly and how do we make sure that they work? And so we asked ourselves the question of what all needs to be built and is it working? What we found was that we're at very early stages of that building. We've only built about 10% and deployed about 10% of all the technologies that we would need to have in place by 2050. So we have 90% of the job still left to be done. And to do that will involve solving a bunch of these physical challenges, exactly along the lines of what we've been talking about. It'll involve figuring out how to scale up the grid, how to scale up critical minerals, how to think about industrial decarbonization, things like steel and cement, how do we get these sectors decarbonized? So there's a bunch of physical issues associated with building things quickly and building things well that we need to do. And so we need that muscle to both innovate and execute quickly to be built as we proceed with this.
Yeah. So I work in the built environment, and the stat that we talk about is 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions actually come from the built environment. So,
and that's because you're running buildings, but you're also the steel and the cement and all the construction activities. It's put all of that together. So that's all the physical world that needs to be decarbonized.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. So final question I'll ask you is, when we think about our current state, right, in climate, we talk about temperature rise, it can kind of feel like doom and gloom sometimes. So what should we be optimistic about in the future?
So I would say 2 things. The first, maybe counterintuitively, is I'm actually very optimistic about the fact that we're not having an adaptation or mitigation conversation anymore. And I think we're now talking about them together. And I think that's just prudent risk management, to use a wonkish term. I'm really glad we're doing that. So that gives me a hope and optimism. Adaptation is it's actually a hopeful thing, right? It's not a bad word anymore. I think the second is actually, it's easy to look at this moment in time and feel like there's no progress being made. And so to that end, what we did this year was to say, let's actually measure the progress we've made. So 2 years ago, when we did this analysis that I mentioned, we found that we had deployed about 10% of the technologies we would need to get to net zero by 2050 or to meet commitments by 2050. Fast forward to 2 years now and today, what we find is that we've deployed about 15% of those technologies. So we've made progress. Now, that progress is actually about half of the rate of progress we would need. So we're not on track to what we've committed to. but it's still progress. And in some areas of that 15%, it's not even, but in some areas like the power sector, like mobility, we've made astounding progress, right? Even critical mineral scale up actually has moved really well. Some areas are very stuck, and across the board progress isn't fast enough, but there is a lot happening. And I think it's about finding the windows of opportunity and really leaning into them and finding the areas that are bottlenecks and stuck and finding ways to unlock them. So I feel optimistic also because it is actually a nuanced picture. It's what I call a tale of many transitions, and finding where there's progress is really important.
Well, Mekala, we can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing all of your knowledge.
It was wonderful speaking with you.
Thank you so much.